Hello, and thank you to all of you who are viewing the webinar live on the Bright Talk channel, and also to you who are viewing it on demand. I sincerely appreciate your interest in this topic, a topic that has challenged salespeople for generations. And as I've spoken to salespeople and sales executives around the world, I've learned from many of them, as well as from the client executives we interviewed in several major studies we conducted. These executives have shared with me what they are looking for in order for salespeople to become perceived as trusted advisors to them. Hello again, and now let me introduce myself. I'm Steve Bistritz, founder and president of SellExcel.com and author of the best-selling sales book, Selling to the C-Suite. Just a little about me. I spent 28 years with IBM as a salesperson, sales manager, and in numerous other positions with IBM, including manager of sales training for a billion-dollar division. Then I became vice president of product development for a small sales training company in Atlanta before starting my own sales training and consulting business in 2002, SellExcel.com. My major focus over the past 30 years or so has been on selling to senior client executives. And as I delivered workshops around the world, salespeople are always asking me about what it takes to become perceived as a trusted advisor to senior executives. I could probably sum up the answer by saying it takes time, effort, energy, and patience, but a little more than that. It's placing the client first, thinking about what's important to them, listening to them, getting their perspective on the products and issues, and only then seeing how your solution or solutions can help address some of those problems. But first, you should spend time at the beginning of the engagement to identify the relevant executive for the sales opportunity. Think about that for a minute, and let me ask you a question. Can you identify the relevant executive for the sales opportunity you're currently pursuing? Or more importantly, can you identify the relevant executive for the last sales opportunity you lost? You're probably sitting there thinking, just how does Steve define the relevant executive? And actually, it's quite simple. So here it is, and you're going to see it again in a few minutes, but I wanted to put it first before I started the session. Simply put, the relevant executive is the executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as a result of the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. Think about that for a minute. The executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as a result of the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. I felt so strongly about that concept that I had devoted an entire chapter around the concept of the relevant executive in the second edition of my book, Selling to the C-Suite. And that reminds me, many of the slides you'll see today come from my one-day workshop, Sell Excel, and you'll see a number of them in my book. I'm going to position this webinar around the pursuit of your sales opportunities to help and explain the concept of becoming the trusted advisor. So what we're asking you to do again is sit on the other side of the desk and view your sales opportunity from the client's perspective. And it should be obvious why you should do that. But unfortunately, even many experienced salespeople don't view their sales opportunity from the client's perspective. And you see on the box in front of you, you can submit questions as we go throughout this session, and I'll answer them at the end of the session. Now, let's look at what I hope to accomplish as we go through today's webinar. Simply put, I'm trying to achieve these simple objectives. How do you circumvent roadblocks that occur? How do you establish credibility with C-level executives? How do you develop some provocative questions to pose to those executives to show them that you have an understanding of their organization and their environment? And then lastly, how do you become perceived as that trusted advisor? And obviously, that's the most important one. How do you become perceived as that trusted advisor? And why do we want to do that? We want to get that return access. So these objectives may sound like common sense, but what we're hoping to do is help you to put them into common practice. We'll begin by discussing the long-term value of a trusted advisor relationship. In other words, why do we want to develop that relationship in any case? And this comes from a book called The Loyalty Effect by Fred Reichheld. And you can see here on this chart, we're looking at the long-term benefit and value to you of becoming that trusted advisor. You know, there's some cost to you in obtaining that client in the first place before you even start. Then year over year, hopefully you're going to have a level of base profit as you develop the relationship with the client. Hopefully you'll also get some revenue growth. And also you see on this chart cost savings. And you might ask, how do you get cost savings in there? Well, the client won't expect you to do certain things because they know and understand how you operate, and you also understand how they operate. So it's more effective for you to be in that kind of environment. They'll also give you referrals, hopefully, to other clients so that you can sell your solutions to their network, if you will. And in addition to that, there's something else here. There's a value premium that you will get as you develop this relationship with the client. Now, in Reichheld's book, he actually calls this a price premium. I prefer to call it a value premium because that's the value that you're going to deliver to that executive, and they're going to measure that value. And they're not necessarily going to beat you up for price and discounts after you develop this relationship with them. When we started to interview C-level executives about their relationships with professional salespeople, I went with an MBA student who conducted some of the interviews. In one of the first practice interviews she conducted, we met with the CIO of a Fortune 500 company whose name you would recognize. After the MBA student asked all the questions we had prepared, I turned to the CIO and I said to him, Jim, why would an executive at your level ever want to meet with a professional salesperson? And here's what he said. He said, Steve, I meet with professional salespeople because often they can offer me solutions that even people within my own organization can't develop. They've seen these problems in other organizations, and I want the benefit of their experience. Now think about how that validated me as a professional salesperson. And what I say to salespeople today, don't look at your rank when you're calling on an executive. Look at the value that you can deliver to the executive. That's how they're looking at you, and that's how they're going to measure you. So then why don't salespeople call on senior executives? When I asked that question of many salespeople, they really answered me in one of three ways. I could summarize it by what you see on this chart. The challenges came down to, number one, being able to identify the right executive or the relevant executive to call on. Who is the right executive that we should be contacting in that client organization? Secondly, fear of failure. And you're right. I mean, if you blow a call at the executive level, your chance of getting back to that executive is probably not very good. So you've got to be prepared to make that call on that senior executive. And number three, you've been blocked. You know, you're calling on lower level people in the client organization. They don't necessarily want you to get to that senior executive. So these are the three reasons that typically salespeople have in terms of their view of why they don't call on senior executives. So let's talk about, again, that that concept of the relevant executive. What executive should you align with in the client organization? What's the right executive to call on, that relevant executive? And again, here's how I define it. The executive who stands to gain the most or lose the most as it relates to the outcome of the project or application that's associated with your sales opportunity. And this is such an important concept. Salespeople need to internalize this definition. And every time they're making a call in the client organization, are they calling on that relevant executive? That's the question they should be asking themselves. And that's the executive who really feels the most pain, and has some skin in the game. So that's the executive that you're trying to get to. So let's take a look at a typical organization chart and pretend that we're trying to sell an IT solution into this organization chart. And on this organization chart, you're going to see three different silos, namely the operations silo, the information system silo in the middle, and then the finance silo to the right, okay? So where do you think the typical IT salesperson would spend most of their time? And if you answered here, you'd be correct. In that silo, in the CIO silo. And probably they're calling on this person, the technology director, Dave Powers in this case. Now, when you look at an organization chart, you can't tell who the relevant executive is. You can't tell from an organization chart. An organization chart really gives you two pieces of information. Really function, okay, what function do they perform within the organization, and then authority. Authority given to you by your rank in the organization chart, okay? You can't tell who the relevant executive is. Now, I happen to know in this particular case, because it's a case study that I developed, okay, that the relevant executive is the CFO, Benjamin Wu, right up here. Benjamin Wu is the CFO. He's the relevant executive for this sales opportunity. Look where we are. We're calling on the IT director at a different silo at a lower level. So we've got to really migrate from the IT silo into the functional area, in this case the CFO, the finance area, and we need to get to the higher level executive, in this case the CFO, Benjamin Wu. His neck is on the line for the success of this particular project. If it goes well, he could potentially be promoted to CEO because the CEO is going to retire in a couple of years. So that kind of information is information that you would get when you're calling on a client organization. So when you're making those calls out there, you've got to keep your eyes open, see what's happening in that organization, see who has the power and influence over the sales opportunity that you're pursuing. Now, I said I worked for IBM for 28 years, and I was there when Lou Gerstner came into the IBM company, an outsider. He had been promoted to CEO. That had never happened before in the IBM company. But at any rate, when he came in, he recognized right away, and in his book, he made this point. He talked about salespeople not calling on the relevant executive. He said salespeople were not spending the time beyond the domain of the CIO. They were not going into the functional areas, and they had not ventured to those areas, and that's where we needed to develop those strong client relationships. And he actually became the role model for doing that, okay? So you're dealing with multiple executives in an organization. How do you tell who the relevant executive is, okay? Who are the irrelevant executives? Maybe somebody you're dealing with. And let me tell you a story about a salesperson who was calling on executives in an organization. And it happens to be a salesperson who was calling on a medical company. He was calling on the medical technology director, very large company, headquartered in the Midwest, and he pursued that executive in an attempt to sell a solution. But he then arranged a meeting with the director and his boss, the chief medical officer, and he arranged that meeting by announcing to the director that the salesperson's regional manager was coming to town and wanted to meet a senior executive at that organization. So the regional manager and salesperson both flew into town for the meeting, and it was the meeting with the director and, in this case, the CMO, the chief medical officer. And it happened there was a snowstorm that day, and the technology director, if you will, wasn't able to make it into the office. But the chief medical officer was there and said that he would still have the meeting because the two people had flown into town, braved the snowstorm, and made it to the company location. But during the meeting, the salesperson introduced his regional manager, reviewed his value proposition, and then discussed his solution. And the CMO said, where do we go from here? How do we move ahead with this? And the salesperson found out that he was now dealing with the relevant executive, the CMO, and the medical technology director with whom he had a prolonged relationship was actually the irrelevant executive. So most importantly, the salesperson now had access to the relevant executive and could contact that executive at any time to further the relationship and to pursue other opportunities. The key is that irrelevant executives will never tell you that they are irrelevant. You have to find out sometimes the hard way by yourself, like this salesperson who was calling on the medical company found out. So let's talk about the different approaches to gaining access to executives, and you see them identified here. You know, internal sponsor, someone at a lower level helps you get to that executive. Somebody who has a credible relationship with the executive can help you get a meeting with a higher level executive. An external referral, someone outside the organization, a business consultant, even a friend, can help you perhaps get a meeting with the right executive, but also the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper of the executive can help you get that meeting. And what I say to salespeople is always treat the gatekeeper as a resource. And in fact, I take it one step further. I say treat the gatekeeper as if he or she was the executive himself or herself, because they can often identify for you what some of the objectives are of that executive. They can help you with your meeting to get to that executive. So treat that gatekeeper as a resource. And after we did studies with executives, we went through a number of different studies with executives, and we asked them about their relationships with professional salespeople. We asked them when they would grant meetings to salespeople and that kind of thing. And one of the things that came out of our research was that 84% of the time, they said they would grant the meeting to a professional salesperson if that recommendation came from someone inside the company. And that could be a lower level executive, or it could be a gatekeeper. So treat that gatekeeper, you know, as if he or she was the executive themselves. That will further your relationships with the executive. Okay, now in preparing your approach to the executive, here's an outline for an initial call on the executive. And you see 4 different components of this call here, 4 different steps. And this is a 3 to 5 minute phone call that you might have maybe with the executive's assistant or with the executive himself or herself to get a meeting. So what do you have to do? Well, number one, you've got to introduce yourself. You've got to explain your connection to the person who referred you, if that's appropriate, okay? So make sure you introduce yourself and the executive knows who you are. And then you've got to be very clear, concise, and specific as you explain the purpose of your call, the second step. Third step is you got to get some credibility with that executive. You've got to be able to provide them with a glimpse of the value you could deliver to them. Why should they be talking to you? Explain how you've helped other companies solve similar problems, if that's appropriate. So you've got to gain some credibility. And lastly, you're going to ask them for some kind of commitment, either to set up a meeting, set up a phone call, be part of a Zoom meeting, whatever the case may be. So the last part is commitment. Now what you want to do is you want to sit down and make some key bullet points here for that phone call. And whenever you're making an important phone call, like you're trying to contact an executive, you want to have those bullet points in front of you. Because what's going to happen in that phone call? You're going to stray from your message. They might ask you a question, get you off track. So you want to have these bullet points in front of you so that you're keeping on track with covering these 4 areas in some way. The most important part of this whole process is right here. Putting yourself in the position of the executive as you develop this approach to them. In other words, sitting on the other side of that desk. Again, viewing your sales opportunity from the client's perspective. And after you develop your message and script it out, okay, here's what you want to do as your next step before you even contact the executive. You develop your message and then record it on your voice message system. Talk to your voice message system as if you were talking to the executive. And then listen to the message and ask yourself the question, how would you respond to the message you just heard on your voice message system? Would you respond positively to that? And then third, you want to improve your message to make it more compelling, more credible, more concise. 3 C words: credible, compelling, concise. Okay? So let's talk about roadblocks that might be in the way to getting that meeting. And I'll first cover, why are roadblocks in place in the first place? Why do they happen? And then secondly, how have salespeople told me that they have successfully circumvented a roadblock? Okay? So the first one is, why are there roadblocks in place? Well, here's what your peers told us about that, salespeople who answered that question. Well, executives perhaps delegate those kinds of meetings. That's the formal process that happens within this organization. They're going to send you to a lower level executive. Perhaps they've had a bad experience with salespeople. They're too busy. Perhaps they've already aligned with a competitor. And maybe in past times, they felt that their time was wasted by salespeople. So they might set up some roadblocks to you getting that meeting with the executive. Now let's talk about why and how salespeople have successfully circumvented those roadblocks. What kinds of techniques have they used to get around some of those roadblocks? And again, here's what your peers said, okay? Organize an equivalent ranked meeting. Well, that's not always important. You can see that in the case of the example that I shared earlier about that salesperson calling on the medical company. He was able to say to the executive that he was calling on, hey, my boss is coming to town. He wants to meet with a senior executive. Can you help arrange a meeting? Most managers or executives will be glad to help you set up that kind of meeting, particularly if they're asked to join the meeting. They want to be in front of that executive also, okay? Another way is to utilize business partners, people that you're working with on this particular company, some people that you might have a relationship with that can help you get a meeting with that executive. The third point on this list is to focus on the past value contribution. What value have you already delivered to this organization? How can you have that play a role in trying to get that meeting with the executive? Another thing is to look for and watch for restructurings or reorganizations that are taking place. When those things happen, players change, and oftentimes there's a perfect opportunity for you to get a meeting with a higher level executive when there's new players in town. The last point on this chart is to leverage the use of social networking. So you've got a lot of ways to do that. You know them probably better than I do. So one key point on that is to make sure that your LinkedIn profile is accurate, up to date, and reflects how you could deliver value to the executive that you're calling on. Because guess what? They're going to look you up on LinkedIn just as you're going to look them up on LinkedIn before you make that call on them. So they're going to know a little bit about you before you even talk to them. So make sure that you have the best face possible. Professional picture in place, and a good profile on LinkedIn. Take a look at my LinkedIn profile if you get a chance. And it's just an example for you to use of how you can create a profile that describes how you can deliver value to the person that you're going to be calling on, because that's the way mine is set up. Okay, one thing I want you to understand, here's another key point for you. Executives are more likely to engage with you not when they understand, but when they feel they are understood. What does that say? They want you to listen to them before you propose any solution. They want to make sure that they have told you what their requirements are before you tell them how you can help them with your solution. So listen before proposing a solution. I can't say that enough. Listen before proposing a solution. Okay? Now let's talk about, becoming that trusted advisor. What are they really looking for in that kind of relationship? Well, here's what David Meister said in his book on Trusted Advisor. Look him up, David Meister, M-E-I-S-T-E-R. He's written a number of books, typically works with professional services organizations, but his concepts apply anywhere in business-to-business selling. And he said that a trusted advisor looks at the relationship more than the outcome of the current transaction. Okay? They want to preserve the relationship. So the executive is looking for a salesperson who's more interested in a long-term relationship than an individual transaction. So think about that as you're making calls on executives. And in my workshop, we ask salespeople this question. Here's an activity we asked them to develop during the course of the workshop. We say to them, think of situations where you have developed a true trusted advisor with one of your client executives. Review the types of activities you performed to achieve that level. And a lot of times when I'm in a workshop, I'll say to salespeople, okay, how many people in this room think they have a trusted advisor level relationship with an executive? A lot of hands will go up. Then I'll say, okay, keep your hands up for a minute. The people who have your hands raised, tell me the answer to this question, which is the key on this chart, and that is, what has the client executive done for you or to you to demonstrate that he or she perceives you as a trusted advisor? What have they done for you or to you? Because if you have a true trusted advisor level relationship with an executive, the relationship will have become collaborative. They'll look for ways to help you. Well, when I asked that question, here's how your peers responded. Again, examples of what the executive has done to perceive you're a trusted advisor. Here's what they said. Lots of things on this chart. But things like shared confidential information, asked you for advice on issues that have nothing to do with your products or services, okay? Provided insight on what it would take for you to win the deal. And here's one that I just heard in a similar presentation that I did a couple of months back. And one of the salespeople said, the executive said that they said no to a better deal at a lower cost from a competitor. And why did they do that? Because they saw your solution as one that could deliver value to them. And they saw the relationship with you as value-driven. So that's what they're looking for you as a salesperson. They might invite you to attend key internal meetings where maybe you are the only outsider. They may ask you to meet with them off-site at lunch or breakfast, maybe not so much these days in the COVID-19 crisis, but, you know, they might ask you or provide you with information that they have shared with nobody else. They perhaps have given you insight into what their personal agenda is, what they hope to achieve in this particular company. So that's some of the ways that they will give information to you to show you that you're that trusted advisor. Now I'm going to give you some personal examples, and 3 different examples for you. Number one, as a professional salesperson selling a solution into a large manufacturing company. I was working with this company, and I met the CEO in the hall one day, and he said, Steve, he said, I'd like to talk to you, and I'd like to share with you what my long-term objective is for this company. I want to become number 1 in the industry, and to do that, I'm going to have to revolutionize my manufacturing process. Would you be willing to spend time with some person on the manufacturing plant floor who can show you what we're doing today, and perhaps you can come up with a better solution? Well, I had been calling on the CFO of this company for a long time, and he was really beating me up over some minor solutions that we were providing to them. But after the meeting with the person on the plant floor, I went back to the CEO and I said to him, Bob, I said, I've got a solution for you that could truly revolutionize your manufacturing process. We've just developed a new solution, and here's how it works and what it can do for you. And after I had shared that with the person on the plant floor, and after I shared that with the CEO, he said, well, let's go ahead. And I sold the mainframe solution to the CEO of the company because he had met me in the hall one day. We had some previous meetings. He had recognized the value that I had continually delivered to this company, and he wanted to share with me what his long-term objective was. And it was something I called the breakthrough initiative that he had not even shared with the CFO. He had not told the CFO that his objective was to become number 1 in this particular industry. They were currently number 3. And we sold them the solution, delivered it, installed it, and they came up. They were number 2 by the end of the year. That's what revolutionary new solutions can help a customer develop when they install it, when they trust you, when they see that you're going to deliver value to them. So that's one example. Second example is an executive with a small sales training company that I said to you, after I left IBM, I went to this small sales training company, and we were selling sales training solutions. We had not sold into this one industry previously, and we had some meetings with the executives of the company. We were competing against about 5 other companies, and after several large meetings with a couple of their executives, I was able to convince them that we had the right solution and the best solution for them. And they finally told us that we had won the deal. And after we won the deal, I went back to the executive and I said, now, Tony, what tipped the scales in our favor? And what he said to me was something I'll never forget. He said, well, you told us that we could make changes to your solution as long as it didn't compromise the integrity of the program, the sales training program that we were going to deliver to them, because we were convinced we had the right direction. And he said, some of your competitors said, we'll make whatever changes you want. And he said, well, we trusted you because of what you said. You were looking out for us as well as for your company, but you put us first. And you wanted to make sure that any of those changes didn't compromise the integrity of the program. So that's why you won the deal. The last point was, in my current company, selling sales training solutions to a global healthcare company, I was actually working with the gatekeeper in this particular company. And the gatekeeper was the administrative assistant to the vice president of global marketing. And she asked me continually for help over a period of 3 to 4 months. I helped her before we had any business with this one particular company. And she finally introduced me to her boss, who was actually asking her for the things that she was asking me to perform for them. And when he found out that I was doing that, and I had no skin in the game at that point, I had not sold them anything, he said to me, I really want you to come in and help our company move forward with your solution. So 3 different examples of how I became a trusted advisor, one to the CEO, second one to the, I guess he was the chief financial officer of the company at the time that we made the deal at the professional services firm. And in my current company, I was working with a gatekeeper who helped me gain access to that executive. So let's talk about, before you even make that initial face-to-face call on the executive, what kinds of things do you want to do? Well, before you even set up that meeting, you want to ask yourself these questions. Number 1, if someone encounters your client in a week and asks her what was covered in the meeting, how do you want her to respond? Secondly, what are the main points you want her to remember? And that's the way you want to begin. That's the way you want to begin. Now, how do you do that preparation? Well, you've really got to prepare at 3 levels of learning. You've got to know something about your client's industry. You've got to know something about your client's company, and that includes your client's customers. Who are their top 5 customers? And you also need to know something about their competitors. Who are their top 5 competitors? And then lastly, the 3rd level is you need to know something about the client executive, himself or herself. Easy way to do that. Look them up on LinkedIn. See who they are connected to. See where they have worked in the past, okay? Perhaps you know someone in the companies that they have worked for in the past, and you can ask them to give you some insight about that client executive. Now that you've done your homework on these 3 levels of learning, your next step is to prepare a set of what I call provocative questions. Questions that challenge the executive and demonstrate to them that you've done some homework, that you've done some preparation. So let's look at some examples of provocative questions that you might ask. For example, how would your customers describe the experience of doing business with your company? You can't get that from the internet. You can find out what you think about their solutions and their company and how they work, but how would your customers describe the experience of doing business with you? Secondly, given the fierce competitive environment in 5 years, what will the survivors have done to endure, to last? Okay, again, information you can't get off the internet. Third, here's another key question, provocative question. What will happen if you decide to delay the implementation of this initiative for 6 more months? What will be affected if that schedule changes? And is any of this initiative mission critical? Okay? So those are insightful, provocative questions that a typical consultant might ask the customer. And that's how you want to appear. Okay? And you want to show that executive you've done that level of preparation. Now, you can access these handouts, okay, the questions on provocative questions handout, and a guide to client discovery that I'll also make available to you that will talk about how you do the research at these 3 levels of learning. Provocative questions has about 75 questions on a couple of pages, examples for you that will really help you when you start to make those calls on senior executives. Okay, so I want you to remember, every interaction you have with an executive either enhances or dilutes your credibility, either moves the needle up or moves it down. You have only one chance to make a first good impression. You don't get a second chance. I can tell you many stories about that. I won't tell you about them here. But making sure that you're prepared for that executive is so important. Okay, another book for you called All for One. And Andrew Sobel has written a number of good books about dealing with developing credibility and trusted advisor types of relationships. And here's what he says, and I agree totally, in terms of maybe the 4 major outcomes of this first face-to-face meeting. You want to quickly establish your rapport. That ought to be obvious to you. Establishing rapport with the executive so that you can work with him or her. Secondly, confirming your understanding of the executive's key business issues. Now, you don't want to go in there and say, what are your 3 key business issues? A better question to ask an executive is, I understand some of your business issues to be X, Y, and Z. Which one of those is most important to you and why? What does that show the executive? You've done some homework. And you want to have their understanding of the executive's key priority. You can't get that off the internet. You can get some insight into their key business issues, but not what's most important to them. Secondly, you want to demonstrate some level of capability. What are you capable of doing for them that can help them? What value could you deliver? And thirdly, or fourthly rather, what are some next steps that involve the executive? You want to get that executive involved in any next steps so you can move forward. Okay? So let's summarize what you have to do to become that trusted advisor. Number 1, your first step is to identify that relevant executive and start aligning with that executive. And that should be one of the key elements of your sales process, identifying and aligning. Okay? Secondly, you want to make sure that you understand this particular phrase. Executives are more likely to engage not when they understand, but when they feel they are understood. Listen before proposing any solution. Thirdly, make certain that you do your homework before that critical initial meeting. We talked about 3 levels of learning. Create some provocative questions that show the executive your level of preparation. Make sure that executive understands you have insight into their operation, okay? And lastly, you want to make sure that you understand that every interaction with the executive either enhances or dilutes your credibility, okay? It either moves the needle up or moves the needle down, okay? So I'm going to end with this cartoon. It's pretty obvious. You know, we've given you the tools now. It's up to you to use them and apply them. Okay, let me see if we have any questions. Yeah, one question here. Can you give us a little bit more information on how you go about identifying the relevant executive? Okay, well, there's a couple of things you can do. You know, when you're pursuing any kind of major sales opportunity, you want to, number one, see if you can determine the executive who initiated the project or application that's associated with the sales opportunity. You might not be able to totally identify the relevant executive yet, but who initiated that project or application? Who's on the evaluation committee for this particular buying decision, all right? Look how these types of decisions were made in the past for similar types of purchases. Talk to other salespeople in your company, perhaps, who have worked with this client, so you can get an understanding from them of what's happened in this particular organization before. And again, look for reorganizations, other events that are happening, restructurings in the client organization to see who comes out as the winner, who loses, what executives are tapped to lead to high visibility special assignments. Look at who's connected to who in the organization. Connections will sometimes be obvious, sometimes they won't be obvious, but when you find out who's connected to who's connected to that person who is at the top leading the charge in a particular area, who is in charge of leading the project, but who is he put in number 2 in command, perhaps, of that particular project. And you want to triangulate all that information. And when you start to triangulate it, it's kind of, like the middle of the night when you have a lightning storm. Everything is suddenly illuminated, okay? Now, one other question that came up, how do you handle awkward moments when we have to discard an irrelevant executive? Great question, okay? Well, sometimes you have to, take a risk. And again, every salesperson looks at what's the risk of making that choice, what's the potential reward, all right? I go back to my example that I showed you before when we talked about the relevant executive being at a different silo and a higher level. Well, we may have to discard that relationship that we have at the lower level with the IT director, for example, because the risk of not getting to the right executive, the relevant executive, is so critical that you'll lose the deal. Okay. One more question: how do you handle awkward? How do you convince your boss the additional time it takes to become a trusted advisor, and patience will deliver the return? Well, that's your track record. You've got to show your boss what your track record is for delivering to the organization. If you're delivering and providing value to your organization as you develop these relationships, that boss will be more trustful of you as it takes you a little bit more time, because you'll deliver the results. I always remember that when I was working for IBM, I had this salesperson who I was working with, and he could get a meeting with any executive, and his boss understood that he developed those trusted advisors